Sorry about this. Actually, that was supposed to be, the first live demo of the presentation and only live demo of the presentation. But I guess the Microsoft Authentication is actually blocking. So the idea was, what you're supposed to see is that I have a little window screen like this with the username and password. But who uses username and password nowadays, right? So in our case, what we do is one of these little cards. Simply tap. No need to type a username. No need to use a password. Logged in. Voila. So, well, again, thank you everyone for showing up for my presentation today. Authentication, the epic saga of tokens, passwords, and digital fortresses, and how to get there. My name is Thierry St-Jacques Gagnon. I speak both French and English. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to use either languages. That's perfect with me. For today, just as a quick introduction, sorry. How do you pronounce my first name? Because that's often a tricky question. So in English, pretty simple. Thierry, close enough. We'll stick to that. In French, super simple. Like, no, it's not Thierry. Please, don't refrain from doing this. It's actually Thierry. All right, now the introduction is done. Who am I? I'm the co-founder and CTO of a company called Calvin Zero. We're based out of Montreal. What we do? Well, we insert trust in digital relationships. That could be authentication, that could be signatures, that could be just validating identity, that could be all sorts of different things, but ultimately it's a trust problem. And the trust problem is really at the core foundational level of anything in cybersecurity. I'm sure you've all dealt with this in one way or another. Who's familiar here with the CIA triangle? All right, good. Some of you. Everyone should know that. C stands for confidentiality, I stands for integrity, and A stands for availability. And the reality is authentication is often used for all three of these things. Oh, my bad. Sorry about this. Yep. Yeah, no, I'm in talk right now. Yep. Okay, thank you. Bye. Sorry about this. God. I'll put it on silence. Yep. Why non? Ouais, je t'entends 206A la pièce. Ouais. OK, bye. Jeez. There you go. Someone picked it up. Thank you. It was a little staged stunt here. Ultimately, authentication is hard to, or cannot be used single-handedly to solve availability, right? Because whenever you want to be in a network and you want to interact with others, you're going to need to expose yourself. You're going to need to be able to take things in without any type of pre-filtration. If I had the white list of phone numbers that could call me today, anyone else would not be able to ever reach me on my phone, right? And that's a bit of an issue. So you need to kind of allow anything to come in and then make the decision, just like I did with the third one, not picking it up and letting it go. However, that can be applied to any private network that you control. And obviously, it's very useful when it gets to confidentiality, making sure you have the right person accessing a resource, for example, or integrity, someone modifying it, someone making sure that the data is not being changed and it is what it is supposed to be representing. And so that's ultimately what we get to. And, in the past, well, we've tried to come up with some pretty cool defense systems, setting up our architectures for it to make sense. And, in the end, it works. We find some workarounds and, we get to have something. We have parts of a ladder, parts of a climbing wall, some, floating boat, somewhat floating, I guess. Or even like a catapult to go around, right? But typically, the way we go is we start here, and then we move on to the next step, which is, hey, we're in production. It works. So, we iterate through things, and we get with, a better, I guess, version than the previous, but not always a great version. And you can see that little goblin just digging a tunnel underneath and getting behind them. So, the password paradox. Well, there's a cost of credential compromise, right? And you'll see this presentation's filled with some kind of Lords of the Ring analogies. I do like Lords of the Ring, so I'll use them freely here. Ultimately, at this point in age, I would say one does not simply trust password authentication. Insert any reason really below. They're fragile, they're brute forceable, they're stealable, phishable, they can be reused, and they are being reused. It's a poor end user experience, and really you're not doing a service either to your customer or your workforce when you use them, and nor yourself, to be quite honest. And they're kind of like an old and rusty lock on a high security vault. Imagine that bank, and all you had was like that little padlock. And any of the guys that were doing, anyone did the village, the lock picking village this weekend? Yeah. So you can get around these pretty easily, right? And there's pretty staggering numbers about credential compromises and all the breaches that kind of came from it. Just in 2022, I think there was something like 15 billion credentials that were compromised just that year. And again, this year we've seen a very high profile case where there's another 10 billion of a single database that was leaked on the dark web and somewhat been made public since being available. And so using a something type of authentication factor nowadays is really asking for trouble. Because it's something implies that you know it, and therefore you're going to go for something that is most likely going to end up a bit too easy. And just last week, actually, NIST released a new updated version to their best practice recommendation to how to deal with password, suggesting that we shouldn't be doing password resets for users anymore, or mandatory ones, unless there's a compromised credentials that's been found. Why? Because, well, typically people tend to take weaker passwords if you ask them to reset them every 90 days or whatever durations you want to set there. And that's all good, and I somewhat agree with their newer recommendation, but at the same time, that's only true if you've educated your users quite well. Because if they stick to the easy passwords and you don't reset them, we're going to get back to where we were 10 years ago. And so just in numbers, why enterprises are moving to passwords nowadays? Well, for one thing, 80%, that's a huge number of data breaches are coming or are results of a compromised credential. 80%. I think in the cybersecurity world, that's probably the lowest hanging fruit you're going to find. Okay, if you can get rid of 80% of your risks for data breaches by doing one thing, you should probably think about it twice. Average cost in 2024 of a data breach, 4.8 million US. That's North America. This number has been growing for the last few years. I don't expect it to be any lower. And that's really just the cost of the breach itself. I'm not talking about reputational costs. I'm not talking about any lawyers' fees involved in this, if you need to replace any type of hardware or anything, just the losses of the breach itself. And we're not talking about any type of lawsuits or class action against our organization. The cost of password. Who here likes their password? Oh, I have two. Why? Okay. Could you use something else that would, for which the statement would still be true? Okay, good. Which is still probable, but there's other ways around, even if you use knowledge-based authenticators, and we'll get to this when we talk about MFA, but there's other ways that people can compromise this. And there's another hand in the back there. Why do you like your password? Okay. Could you get something very easy for you and hard for other people? Yeah. Okay. I know a language that pretty much no one knows. It's called cryptography. Very few people actually know cryptography. And you know what? It makes it very easy for you to use in the end. And so ultimately, where I'm getting to is just the cost of having password. Just a password reset is now estimated at an average of $70 to do a password reset in an enterprise per password reset. Anyone here work IT help desk at some point or still does? How often do you do password resets? Daily, a lot, too often. I mean, I once had a job at I won't name the RCMP here, but you know, I was doing password resets for pretty much all day, every day for many months when I started. That's where I started my career in cybersecurity, actually. And so, yeah, average cost $70. You know, the annual password-related support costs for large organizations, those are 5,000 in the US, those are 5,000 plus employees, $1 million. So if I come to you with a solution that gets rid of passwords for less than $1 million, you should all say yes, right? All right, I'll talk to you all after. And then in the end, as I mentioned, you know, poor user experience. You know, 75% of users are frustrated with password. I was at the Polar 2 days ago, and there was someone else doing a talk saying that, you know, about 74% of users are in the end not going to follow policies in general, not just for password, just in cybersecurity policies. Very close number, right? This is typically the number that represent friction issues with security in general, right? And the other 25% are okay with it. We saw a few people here that were okay with it, and to be quite honest, I was okay with the passwords I was using before I switched, but I would never go back to passwords nowadays. The other thing you need to look out for is, are you ready for the rise of generative AI? You're all aware of what phishing is, but you know, it's been quite common since ChatGPT, but not just ChatGPT, but any generative AI really, to improve phishing scams, business email compromise, all these things. And it's been ongoing for the last, I'd say, a year and a half where they've been using and they've been able to really catch up to people. And you know, click rate through those that are typically much higher than what you will see in your typical phishing test you'll run in your organization. So I suggest if you were doing these type of tests and it's been approved within the organization before, I suggest that you try one that would be leveraging generative AI, especially if you have one that's contained within your own environment where you could safely use, let's say, your own knowledge of your infrastructure without it being leaky. You'd be surprised at how much it goes. Moving away from this, there's been protocols, there's been standards, there's been a bunch of different things that have been worked on for the last while, actually. And I'll call them the League of the Extraordinary Protocols. They're not all protocols, but we'll get to that. Starting with SAML. SAML I see a bit, again, to go back to my Lords of the Ring analogy here, kind of like the Gandalf, it's the old one. SAML, for those who don't know, was initiated in 2001 by basically the Security Services Technical Committee of the OASIS organization that does open standard, mostly out of Europe, but I guess globally now. And they came up with SAML 1.0 in 2002. In 2005, SAML 2.0 was released. We're still using SAML 2.0 as of today. So if you use a deployment of any type of solution that leverages SAML, hopefully it's SAML 2.0. If it's not, please change. You should have done that almost 20 years ago or 19 years ago now. There are very well-known ways around the SAML 1.0, but the SAML 2.0 has kind of been quite robust, has been offering a lot of advantages for organizations, especially in the large enterprise segments. It's based on XML. So the challenge that Oasis had when they first started, was to create an XML-based technology that would offer, you know, great use in web technologies specifically, to be able to create the concept of federations. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what is an identity federation, or like see it as a joint domain into an organization that's controlled by a single set of identity. And the idea is that it was exactly that. It was for people to be able to access multiple web applications using one set of login credentials. What it turned out into is big tech players, you know, grabbing all the authentication and identity for all your systems in the end. There's a benefit to that, but there's also, you know, some downside of being stuck in that area. However, from let's say an implementation standpoint, SAML kind of makes sense. It's done in 8-step, much more efficient than what was done before, also much more safer. And typically start with something like an end user's browsing, requesting a target resource. And so the user agent, which is the one in the middle, for those in the back, I don't know if you can see well or not, but user agent in the middle. The far left is a service provider, so see it as an app that runs on a web server or any service really. It could be APIs, could be a bunch of different things. And then you have the identity provider that is on far right. So you start with the request of the target resource. Then the service provider redirects to an SSO service. From there, the user agent will request the SSO service from the identity provider. So a bit of redundancy here. And within that, actually, I'm skipping to the next one, but just to mention, you request a service, you actually identify the user, and that's a topic that's very important. There's been a lot of discussions everywhere around the world about digital identities. People have been thinking of digital identities as user accounts, right? A digital identity is a digital representation of yourself. It doesn't have to be just a user account. It is much more than that, and if you go to Microsoft, Google, or all the big IDPs, they have a pretty nice profile on you typically. And so it's way more than just your username combined with a credential. So you identify the user, and from there, it responds with an XHTML form. And this allows the user agent to then request an assertion consumer service from the service provider. So that's what we'll get into that. I'll give an example quite quickly. And then from there, you're redirected to the target resource, which is originally where you were trying to go. And what you do, you need to re-request a resource. Why? Because when you first requested it, you were not authorized, you were not authenticated. So you had nothing. At this point, you're now identified and you're authenticated. Then what it's going to do, the service provider itself is going to actually do an authorization, and if you have the right to access the resource, it's going to respond and provide the resource itself. Anyone sees any potential improvement to this type of sequence or flows? Yeah, definitely duplication. So a bit of efficiency that could be done there. I won't say it's super complex. That's an abstracted view. By the way, pretty much all of these steps, if you go into the different profiles that exist in SAML, have their own sequence diagram for each of these different steps. So it's more than 8 steps, but let's say those are the 8 high-level ones. And aside from improvements on performances or being able to be a bit more straightforward into how it works, any other improvement that could be done? Any security concerns that someone can think of here? No. So I'll get to the next slide, which is, and you're not going to be able to read, that's fine. You should be able to pick up that this is XML. This is typically what's being exchanged. I mentioned about the assertions. That's where the assertions are being evaluated, or that's what's used to evaluate the assertions, and then do the authorization layer. The issue is how do you know that the user that requested the resource the second time is the same as the first one? The signature, sure. Where is the signature? Like, where is that signature? Correct. Yeah, that's good. Huh? He knows the SAML. That's good. You followed Gandalf's quote earlier. Just speak of what you know. That's good. One of the issue with this is typically will take form of either a cookie, not so much anymore, or a token. And that if that's captured, it's basically the proof of the claim for which you're getting that assertion. And I'm sure you've all heard about token hijacking or session hijacking, things like that. This is where it falls short, right? If this can be intercepted, this can be replayed or replicated, sorry. Then you have a way in, and you have full authentication and authorization. Aragorn, not as old, a bit more modern, still quite robust, and it's just gonna go in there and fight till the end. I kind of see it as OpenID Connect, which is actually a protocol that's been built on top of OAuth. Who's familiar with OAuth? Like in the intricacies of OAuth. So OAuth is a very, very complex not standard, by the way. It's a framework. It's a set of collection of standards and protocols. And it's a great toolkit. Does a lot of things. You can go to content management, authorization, authentication. You can do a lot of things with OAuth. But be aware, if you do your own implementation of everything, you really need to dig down in the documentation to make sure you're not doing something, let's say, stupid by trying to come up with your own protocol on top of OAuth. One of the benefits is OpenID Connect does it for you. It's an open standard once again. This one is basically connecting IDPs, or what they call OpenID providers, with something called a relying party. Relying parties see it a bit of as if it's the application or the website itself that outsources its user authentication to an authentication server. The authentication server could be the relying party, could also be the identity provider, and it could be a service that's separate from the two. We call that delegated authentication or delegated IDP services. Typically, it involves, again, an identity token. I mentioned about, we talked about quickly about tokens just a slide before, but you typically have an identity token that represent basically an outcome of the authentication process. So it mentions whether it was successful or not. Again, if this is able to be intercepted, stolen, or anything like that, there's a bit of an issue of using it to do some kind of replay attacks or just impersonate someone else. And it could be done on a different device too. We've seen some attacks like this against Microsoft about 1.5 years ago on a large scale. It's fairly important to make sure that these are ephemeral, for one thing. Remember me forever is probably not a good thing. It means it stays on your device forever, and if it ever gets stolen, it means someone else could eventually get there forever as well, unless you void the actual session as a token. It's well designed. That said, it contains at the minimum an identifier for the user, which is often called a subject, and there's a subject claim for that, and basically there's information about when the user was authenticated, and from there you can do some analytics on this, and this is where we've started to see way more adaptive MFA or AI authentication, like anything else, and it can contain some additional identity data as well. The steps for OpenID Connect, a bit simpler than OAuth, but we just went through, so we're going to fly through those. They're straightforward. Typically, the end user navigates to websites or web application, a service. Again, could be APIs, could be all sorts of different things. And then the end user clicks, sign in, for example, type their username and typically a password. The relying party, so call it a client if you want, sends a request to the OpenID provider. Okay, that's the OP, or in a broader generality, a lot of people will refer to this as the IDP, just to kind of map it to the equivalent into the SAML protocol or other protocols. Then the IDP authenticates the user, obtains the authorization, so that's done on the IDP side of things, and it responds with the identity token and usually an access token. That's a distinction. Okay, that's important. That's one of the benefits of OpenID Connect. Makes it much more modular for when someone is developing. You don't need to worry about those. The access token really is the one that's going to give you as the name implies, the access. The relying party can then send a request with the access token to the user device and actually let the connection take place. And there's a claim that's returned here with the user info and making sure we have the claims for the right user going into the service. OpenID, again, open standard, quite useful. There's libraries for it. It's kind of like the newest authentication protocol that you'll find for federated system. To the next one. So we have our Bilbo Baggins here. And a great quote saying, "Some believe it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But it is not what I have found. It is the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folks, like you and I, that keep the darkness at bay. Small acts of kindness and love." Well, that's I'll skip that part in cybersecurity. But then he goes on saying, why Bilbo Baggins? Why that small hobbit, right? And he answers saying perhaps it's because he's afraid and that he gives him courage. And ultimately, it's what we've seen with FIDO2 and Passkeys in the last year and a half, if you've been following the authentication schemes. A lot of people have been talking about this. It seems it actually waking up a lot of organizations, a lot of eyes. The reality is it's again, it's a specific execution of everything that we've seen so far, and just into a new form, and it allows all sorts of different things to take place, specifically passwordless authentication. So FIDO2, again, it's done by the FIDO Alliance. It's an open standard. There's a FIDO1, those that were used to the old YubiKeys, the U2F, second factor of authentication. That would be FIDO1 typically. FIDO2, technically there's a version number within FIDO2, such as FIDO 2.1, for example. Aims at providing passwordless authentication. So you typically have, a relying party, as I mentioned, or an application per se. You have the browser that's involved. You have a platform. You have internal authenticators as well that can be used. That's an optional. It's an on-device authentication. Think of TPMs on laptops, secure enclaves on phones, etc. Then there's a second option, which is an external authenticator. That can be a USB key, could be a mobile device, could be a smart device such as a watch, could be a card. There's all sorts of form factor that here. The form factor itself is not really important, but is providing basically a way of authenticating that's separated from the device where you're doing the authentication. So you kind of keep the keys or the cryptography outside of the device that you use to access any type of resource. Ultimately, you have a FIDO authentication. It leverages some other standards, WebAuth and CTAPs. This is the flow that's pictured here. Those are also open. You can explore them. They're actually quite well documented. So if you want to dive into it, I think that's probably a good option to start there. Skip the rest that doesn't pass, and then you're probably just going to be able to find proper implementation of either SAML or OpenID Connect that will leverage FIDO2 authentications. And you can also have an optional, it seems like it's mandatory on this diagram, but that arrow on the right, typically the relying party app server should be querying a FIDO server to make sure that the authenticator that's being used has been kind of approved using some metadata on top. I'll be quite honest, most authentication servers do not use it. And it's very simple to do this. If you develop a new authenticator and you try it, they will usually let you in as long as you comply with the actual standard, and they have no idea what cert or any type of metadata that pertains to your device, and it still lets you in. So probably a bit of improvement for the future on the adoptions or the implementations, people leveraging these authentication systems, but allows us to get to know a bit more information about which device is really being used to do that FIDO authentication. Because from a server standpoint, it's kind of blind to what it is. On this, I think you could get to a point where you can secure all your enterprise users with a complete authentication system, right? You have different options. We mentioned, the internal authenticators or external authenticators. There's different forms, right? Ourselves at Kelvin Zero, we have what we call the Multi-Pass Pro and Multi-Pass Digital. One is a card, the other one is a mobile device, or an app. Sorry, and also works with an authentication service, which can either be an IDP, a relying party, or it can be a delegated IDP or authentication server. And the distinction in here, if I go into the digital versus the card, is quite important, because there's something that's been hidden to most people that were not aware of what passkeys were. Okay. When they created a concept of passkeys, they kind of hid that security spectrum. That was something that was developed by FIDO actually a long time ago. And it really delineates the difference on the security spectrum of all the different solutions, right? You will have the traditional password that would be on the far left, that's outside of FIDO2. You have the password with some kind of phishable MFA, so think of U2F again, or OTPs, SMS, et cetera, or code sent by email, something like that. Then you have multi-device passkeys. So those are passkeys that are created on multiple devices, and wherever on any of the device you go, you're using the same passkeys. The downside of this, it's great for convenience, but the downside of this obviously is I may be using my phone with one passkey, but someone could be on my computer and using my passkey and it will still let them in. And there's no difference, it's the same one and it's valid, then the assertions are still gonna be valid. So unless you add a layer of intelligence on top, and again, AI, making sure, oh, why is this device and this other device in 2 separate countries accessing this resource at the same time with the same passkey? You know, you're typically gonna miss those. Then you have single device enterprise passkeys. Doesn't have to be enterprise, but we're talking about the enterprise here. This is really, see it as a typical PKI. You know, you have one device where you can do it, and that's it. And if you want to move to another device, you have no passkeys, you're not going to be able to authenticate with it. And then finally, you have the last one, and we're talking about, you know, a next generation of authentication where you have portable hardware, typically could be software, but portable roaming authenticator devices. And that means you carry your passkeys with you, but they will work on different device because the actual authenticator you use to do it is the one doing the authentication. The device is really just relaying the information or the signatures that are done in the challenge. So, you know, at that point, you could get to a point where you can secure your workforce and customers with phishing-resistant MFA. Right? We're talking resistant to phishing, resistant to SIM swap, resistant to keyloggers. Someone mentioned keyloggers was maybe the only way to steal their passwords. Credential stuffing. All of these typical threats that you're already aware of, you can get there, right? And what we do as well, and not going into a sales pitch, but we typically have these 2 solutions, either a card or a phone, and they have some differences, right? When we talk about a phone, obviously it's a convenience, and that's true. I'm sure you've seen some other solutions in the past that leverages some mobile applications to do this. The benefit of it is convenience. Everyone would kind of agree with this typically. You know, they're versatile. They're, you know, on-the-go champions. You can carry it. You don't need extra stuff. Most people have a mobile device. There's some downsides. You know, some of you probably work in large organizations that have unions where unions will say, well, hold on, pay for a phone for all the employees if you want them to use it. That's a possibility. I think it's really a matter of is the employer offering something to the employee that's a benefit to the employee as well, right? Because if you do have something that I was mentioning earlier, like a portable roaming authenticator device, it means the employee can also use it in its individual life. And that becomes, in my opinion, an incentive, and it actually ups the cybersecurity posture of that individual. Because really, let's be honest, when we do authentication, we're not authenticating an employee. We're not authenticating a customer. We're authenticating either a human, a system. We're authenticating an entity. And we give it a context to say, oh, it's an employee or it's a customer. But the reality is we're authenticating entities. And we define what an entity can do into a given context. But I'm sure that if all of you were to go to your peers and colleagues and you were to offer a solution that can improve their daily lives outside of the organization, they probably wouldn't complain about having it, and government then may even say, well, that's a taxable benefit. The card, on the other hand, well, it's offline, it's inert, it's self-contained, so it's not a chatty device, it's not a leaky device. It can't be taking some data out and sending it to a company that's going to monetize it in the end. And basically, you make sure that the authentication is done separately from, again, the device where you're accessing the resource. And that all of this basically allows you to enable secure workforce use cases. There's a lot of them, but basically passwordless MFA that's done in a single go, passwordless SSO. You can do passwordless remote security. You can do remote access. You can do help desk identification, right? How do you know that the person you're interacting with is actually who they claim to be, not just that they have a password that's valid, but actually is the person that you're supposed to be talking with. You can do step-up authentication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different things that it can do for you, and it can help you protect and delight your workforce. And by that, I mean they won't want to go back to their password. With that said, if you're more in the SMB world, there's a few things that you should be looking for. Obviously, security, convenience, interoperability being the top there, but going to something that offers a Passkey solutions that are cost effective. It's going to be typically a big focus of smaller organizations. Also something that's easy to deploy because they don't often have the infrastructure teams to put it in place and manage everything. They may not have a SOC, they may not have cyber teams or anything. It might be a one-man shop. And ideally you want to be compatible with multiple platforms because these small organizations typically have a bit of a, let's call it a fluctuating environment, making decisions sometime on one platform, sometimes on another. They may not be able to interoperate, but if you can actually provide a solution that's going to be able to work with multiple platforms, you may be able to offer some kind of a SSO or single point of authentication from a user standpoint. Also, what you should be looking for, if you're one of them, I touched on the platform, but also maybe you want something that's hybrid or can offer on-prem deployment, depending on your use case and the company and the type of information you're dealing with. Your industry may have regulation that can get you into trouble if you don't have it on-prem, for example. You should be able to create and manage users because if you're an SMB and you're just getting to here, you're probably not really locked in with an IDP. You still have the flexibility of making a decision, changing it, and that gives you the opportunity of actually taking this out of the lock and then decide which ecosystem you want to live in the future. You should be able to associate specific authenticators to a user. So not just any authenticator, but let's say a specific card, as I mentioned, or a specific USB key, or a specific phone, or laptop, or anything like that. See it as MDM without the very expensive features of MDM solutions out there today. Something that gives you some authentication analytics, AI. Something that's passwordless first. Why go through the trouble of getting a password for your users to start with if you're just launching your company, for example? And ideally something that's even login-less, that removes the concept of having a username. Because one thing that we can probably take and has kind of been exposed into decentralized systems, so cryptocurrency and all these things, right, is the fact that when you use typical asymmetric cryptography, you don't need to have a user. The identity is the representation of all the cryptographic keys that they have on a given decentralized system. And by just verifying a signature of one of these keys, you know who, you don't know who it belongs to. You don't need to know who it belongs to. You just need to know that it belongs to the person that it should belong. And that's kind of the idea. You missed it in the demo that I did to start, but I was in a username and password prompt from Windows, no username. I just touched it and logged me into my account with PowerPoint running, the proper session. If I was to ask one of my colleagues in the room to just come in and do the same thing, it would log them into their profile on my device using their Passkey solution, their authenticator device. Other things they may want to look, and that's kind of future-proofing, but decentralized SSO. This is a new concept where basically you're unifying different domains, unifying different federation from an authentication standpoint so that even if it's outside your control environment, it's kind of like an SDN-defined authentication for any other system. So there's still limitation there because there's a lot of vendors that will unfortunately sell you SSO as an improved feature on like a higher tier of their solution or something like that. They're selling the security of their product. I think down the road, it's going to get to a point where hopefully buyers of technologies are going to say, you're getting me to pay for you to add security in your product? Sorry, I'm moving on to another vendor. Again, cross-federation is akin to this. Something that's FIDO2 certified, I was mentioning it's probably the new kids on the block type of thing. Try to go there right away if you can. And something obviously that's interoperable with the other standards that exist, OpenID, SAML. If you need to go to NTLM, do it, but I would say please add some kind of abstraction in front. And then maybe you're at a point where you have somewhat of a reasonable digital fortress that you can protect. But keep in mind, there's always going to be bad actors out there, right? There are going to be some of these giant demons full of flames and fire they're going to have to fight off. Recently, we touched on LLMs earlier, but recently with deepfakes, it's been becoming a bit of a problem, especially if you've been using facial recognition for your biometric authentication. Even if you were doing passwordless but using facial recognition, these deepfakes can actually bypass some of them. Just recently, Sam Altman was impersonated by someone. There's content that was published as if it was from, and then of course I have a blank here, most famous pop star? Someone. Who? Sorry. No, not well. Maybe it happened to Drake too. I wouldn't be surprised. Yes, Taylor Swift. Thank you. And with regards to the election in the U.S., actually, so is interference into the elections over there, but it's impersonating a very well-known personality out there that a lot of people are following. You can see I'm not a big Taylor Swift fan. Nothing against her, really, just not my style. But even something like typical MFAs, like Google Authenticator, well, there's some issues with those designs. They're trying to make it prevalent and kind of keep them into their ecosystem. And one of the issue, for example, in this case, important to know if you're using Google Authenticator, it's backing up the recovery codes or the TOTP one-time use codes that you can use in case you're offline automatically to the Google account. Well, what do you think happens if the Google account's compromised? Like, it's there. So a company called Retool was compromised, and actually it was made worse. Why? Because the threat actor had access to the recovery tools from within the Gmail account, or sorry, not Gmail, Google account. And so be aware of sometimes these features are, yes, providing some ease of use and convenience, but I think the way in offering this is to rethink the way we design things and make it a bit better. And more recently, there's been a lot of infiltration done by state actors. This one is pointing to a specific one. I won't go as far as this, but there's probably different state actors that are doing this, just trying, or just even cyber criminal groups trying to infiltrate the organization using deepfake to impersonate actual, real human beings that you may want to hire. They do the exams, et cetera, et cetera. They do the interviews. You hire them, and then in the end, they're a bad actor, and they're within. You're now dealing with an internal threat issue, and that's a whole other story. And so even with MFA, those can actually be bypassed if they're given trust from the get-go as an employee, for example. And then for the future frontier, everything beyond authentication, right? We can think of things such as digital identity, such as what the government of Quebec wanted to put in place, and honestly, every provincial government in the country, every country is now probably looking at this also. There's issues that are on the verge of quantum computing, for example. What's going to happen? Everyone's relying right now on asymmetric cryptography. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to probably need to either switch everything to quantum-ready crypto or find a way to use symmetric encryption, but do, key exchanges are not going to be vulnerable, right? Because TLS is not going to stand this if you stick to elliptical curves or DDS or anything like that. So, we need to foresee these things, and they're going to have an impact on authentication. They're going to have an impact on way more. But one thing that's going to remain for sure is still and always will be tied to a specific entity, whether it be automated system, human being. That depends, but it's going to be a case, and it's going to affect payment. It's going to affect all sorts of different things related to the verification of who your true identity is. And one thing maybe to end on is, as blue teamers, as people working on the defensive side, we need to be hockey goalies. If we let one puck in, it's 1-0 for the other team. And as goalies, it's pretty hard to score, by the way, right? So if it is 1-0, good luck trying to make it 1-1. If you're on the offensive side and you get that goal, you win. So, people in cybersecurity are all unsung heroes because, when we do a shutout, it's still only 0-0. We never win. We just keep it tied and we just keep going until they score, right? What a lot of people have been saying, it's not a matter of if you're going to get compromised, it's when you're going to get compromised. That's because we flipped the odds. But we shouldn't have mass compromission anymore. This is preventable. If you switch to something like FIDO2 and you go to authenticator devices, there's no way for a threat actor to actually, at scale, leak all, let's say, hardware-based authentication tokens for a whole organization all at once. If they want to compromise, let's say, the card that I used earlier, they need to steal this, they need to steal this, or rather this one. And if they want to do it for another user, they need to start again. And they need to do it in person with close proximity. And that is maybe something that we've lost in the past. We tried to turn everything digital, but the true problem we're solving when we're doing authentication is closing the gap between the physical world and the digital world. But if you use both, it's going to make it one order of magnitude harder for threat actors to compromise you. And so think about it. 80% of the breaches, if you can solve this and making it an order of magnitude harder for any threat actors to get in, I think you're going to be in a good position and you're going to be able to go back to that fortress. So thank you very much. Are you ready to go passwordless? If so, you can come and talk to me. I have some colleagues also. We're going to be outside the room. I can take some more questions, discuss with you. We also have some cards that we can give away. So, please feel free to come and see us. And I guess I'll take any questions, French or English.